The day Elena Márquez's mother died giving birth to her stillborn brother, the clouds stopped coming to Redemption, Texas, and the town decided it was her fault. Elena had been 17 then, standing in the small adobe house on the edge of town, watching her mother's blood seep into the floorboards while the midwife shook her head, and the sky outside remained a merciless, cloudless blue. It was April of 1877, and that was the last time rain fell on the parched earth of their small cattle town. Now 3 years later, in the spring of 1880, Elena was 20 years old, living alone in that same house her father had abandoned 6 months after her mother's death, unable to look at her without seeing his dead wife. The townspeople whispered that Elena carried death in her shadow, that God had marked her family with misfortune, and wherever she walked, prosperity died. She heard them at the general store when she came to trade the eggs from her few remaining chickens. She heard them at the church steps on Sundays, though she stopped attending after the 4th time someone spat at her feet. She heard them in the saloon when she walked past, the word curse following her like a second shadow. The cattle were dying, the crops had failed 2 seasons running, and the creek that ran through town had become a thin, pathetic trickle that barely sustained the remaining livestock. Someone needed to be blamed, and Elena, with her dark eyes and her solitary existence and her family's tragedy, made an easy target. She was drawing water from her well one scorching morning, the sun already brutal at 8 o'clock, when she heard the horses approaching. Elena looked up to see Mayor Hutchins riding toward her house with 5 other men, their faces set hard as the drought cracked earth. Her stomach tightened. Nothing good ever came from men riding in groups. "Elena Márquez," the mayor called out, not bothering to dismount. He was a thick-necked man with a perpetual sunburn and eyes that had grown colder toward her with each rainless month. "The town council has made a decision. We're asking you to leave Redemption." The water bucket slipped from her hand, splashing across her worn boots. "Leave? This is my home. My mother is buried here." "Your presence is a blight on this town," said Samuel Garrett, who owned the largest ranch in the area and had lost 200 head of cattle to the drought. "Ever since your mother's unnatural death, we've suffered. God's judgment is clear." "My mother's death was not unnatural. She died in childbirth, which happens to women everywhere," Elena said, hearing her voice rise despite herself. "And I have nothing to do with the drought. Weather is weather, not witchcraft." "Then explain why every venture you're near fails, misses." Hutchins spoke up, her face pinched beneath her bonnet. "Thomas Bell's store caught fire the day after you shopped there. The Henderson baby took fever after you walked past their home. And the rain hasn't fallen since the day your mother died under this very roof." "Coincidence and cruelty," Elena said, but her voice shook. "You're looking for someone to punish because you cannot punish the sky." "You have 1 week to pack your things and go," Mayor Hutchins said. "After that, we cannot guarantee your safety. Some folks are talking about more than just asking." They rode away, leaving Elena standing in a puddle of spilled well water, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had no money to speak of, nowhere to go, and no family to take her in. Her father had gone to California chasing gold rumors and never written. She had no skills beyond keeping a small homestead alive, and barely that. The garden had died despite her efforts. Her chickens were down to 4, and she traded eggs and mending work for flour and beans. How would she survive on the open road alone? That night, she sat on her small porch watching the stars emerge in the cloudless sky, wondering if she should just start walking and let the desert take her. Maybe the town was right. Maybe she was cursed, and death was the only companion she deserved. She was still sitting there when she heard the single horse approach near midnight. Elena tensed, her hand moving to the old rifle that had been her father's, but the rider stopped at a respectful distance and called out, "Miss Márquez? I mean no harm. May I approach?" The voice was male, young, unfamiliar. Elena kept her hand on the rifle. "State your business." "My name is James Colton. I'm new to redemption, just hired on at the Garrett Ranch. I heard what happened this morning and I wanted to say it's wrong. What they're doing to you is wrong." Elena squinted into the darkness. The moon was bright enough that she could make out a tall figure, broad-shouldered, with a hat pushed back on his head. "Why would you care about a stranger's trouble?" "Because I've been blamed for things that weren't my fault before, and I know how it eats at you," he said. "And because I don't believe in curses. I believe in droughts. And this one is real bad. But it's not caused by a 20-year-old woman living in a house by herself." Something in Elena's chest loosened slightly. "You should go before someone sees you here and decides you're cursed too." "Let them decide what they want. I'm not much for following crowds." He paused. "I know you don't know me from Adam, but if you need help leaving town safely, I can ride with you. Make sure you get somewhere without trouble following." "Why would you do that?" Elena asked, suspicious despite the small spark of hope in her chest. "Because it's the right thing to do," James Colton said simply. "Think about it. I'll be at the Garrett North pasture most days if you want to send word." He rode away before Elena could respond, leaving her staring after him in confusion and something that might have been the first hint of warmth she had felt in months. Someone believed her. Someone thought the town was wrong. She held on to that thought like a candle flame against the dark. The next 3 days passed in tense preparation. Elena packed her few belongings into the 2 saddlebags and 1 trunk she could carry, sold her chickens to the Mexican family that lived outside town and had always been kind to her, and tried to figure out where she could possibly go. San Antonio was a 3-day ride. Maybe she could find work there as a seamstress or a cook. Maybe the curse rumors would not follow her to a city large enough to swallow one unfortunate woman. On the 4th day, she was in her garden attempting to salvage a few potatoes from the cracked earth when she heard shouting from town. Elena stood, shading her eyes, and saw smoke rising from the direction of the main street. Her stomach dropped. Fire was every wooden frontier town's nightmare, especially in drought conditions. She should stay away. She should keep her distance and let the town that hated her fight its own battles. But Elena could not shake her mother's voice in her memory. The lessons about helping neighbors no matter what, about being better than those who hurt you. She grabbed 2 buckets and ran toward town. The general store was burning, flames licking up the dry wooden walls with terrifying speed. Half the town was already there, forming bucket lines from the nearly dry creek, passing water that seemed pathetically inadequate against the roaring fire. Elena joined the line without a word, grabbing a bucket and passing it along, then another, then another. Her arms burned, her dress soaked with spilled water and sweat, but she kept moving. "What's she doing here?" someone shouted. "Probably started it herself," another voice called back. "I was in my garden all morning," Elena gasped out, passing another bucket. "I came to help." "We don't want your help, curse bringer," Samuel Garrett snarled. But he still grabbed the bucket she passed him and threw the water on the flames. They fought the fire for 2 hours before finally containing it. The general store was a total loss, but they had kept the flames from spreading to the adjacent buildings. Elena collapsed on the ground, coughing from smoke, her hands blistered from the rope handles of the buckets. People stepped around her, shooting her dark looks but saying nothing. She had helped save their town, and they could not quite bring themselves to thank her for it. "Here," a voice said, and a canteen appeared in front of her face. Elena looked up to find James Colton crouching beside her, his face smudged with soot. Up close for the first time, she could see he was perhaps 23 or 24, with dark blonde hair and gray eyes that looked at her with concern rather than fear. "Drink slowly." Elena took the canteen with shaking hands and sipped the warm water. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. "Thank you." "That was brave, coming to help," James said quietly. "Foolish, maybe, but brave." "They already hate me." "What did I have to lose?" Elena said, but she smiled faintly. "At least now they cannot say I burned down their store." "They'll find a way to blame you anyway, won't?" James said. "That's what frightened people do. They find a target and they aim everything at it so they don't have to be scared of things they can't control." You sound like you're speaking from experience. James's face tightened. My father was a union organizer in Pennsylvania. When the mine explosion happened, the owners blamed him, said he was agitating the workers and caused carelessness. Never mind that they had ignored safety complaints for months. Mob burned our house down when I was 15. My father barely got us out alive. He looked at Elena directly. So I know what it's like when a crowd decides you're the devil, and I know it has nothing to do with truth. Elena felt something shift between them, an understanding that went beyond words. I'm sorry that happened to you. I'm sorry this is happening to you, James said. He stood, offering her his hand. Let me walk you home. You look about ready to fall over. I'm fine, Elena said automatically, but when she tried to stand, her legs wobbled. James caught her elbow, steadying her. His hand was warm and calloused and solid, and Elena realized with a start that it had been 3 years since anyone had touched her with kindness. The realization made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. They walked slowly back to her house on the edge of town, James leading his horse with one hand while keeping the other hovering near Elena's elbow in case she stumbled. The afternoon sun was brutal, and the walk felt twice as long as usual, but Elena found herself grateful for the company. It felt like being human again instead of a ghost everyone avoided. You're really planning to leave? James asked as they approached her small adobe house. I don't have much choice. The mayor gave me a week, and 4 days are already gone. After that, he said he couldn't guarantee my safety. Elena laughed bitterly, as if there's been any safety before now. James was quiet for a long moment. What if you didn't go alone? Elena stopped walking, looking at him sharply. What do you mean? I was only planning to work at the Garrett Ranch long enough to earn stake money anyway. I'm heading west eventually, maybe California or Oregon. If you wanted company on the road, I could leave when you do. Traveling alone is dangerous for anyone, but especially for a woman alone. With 2 riders, we'd both be safer. You would give up your wages here to help someone you barely know? The wages aren't much, and Garrett's an unpleasant man to work for, James said. Besides, I told you it's the right thing to do. And, he added, and Elena thought she saw color rise in his face, I'd like to know you better. You seem like someone worth knowing. Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. She wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to grab onto this offer of companionship and safety like a drowning woman grabbing a rope. But caution made her hesitate. You could end up cursed too in their eyes. Good thing I don't believe in curses then, James said with a slight smile. Only in droughts and decent people having a hard time. I don't have much money, Elena warned. I can't pay you. I'm not asking for pay. I'm asking if you want a traveling companion who knows how to shoot, can hunt for food, and is moderately good company when he's not too tired to talk. James met her eyes. What do you say, Elena Márquez? Will you let me ride with you? It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his voice, warm and respectful and real, made Elena's decision. She held out her blistered hand. I say yes, James Colton, and thank you. His handshake was firm and careful of her blisters, and the smile he gave her was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Elena thought that maybe, just maybe, leaving Redemption might not be the end of her life, but the beginning of something she could not yet name. They spent the next 2 days preparing for the journey. James came by each evening after his work at the ranch, helping Elena repair her father's old saddle and determine what she could realistically carry on her aging mare, Paloma. He brought supplies from his own earnings, dried beef, hardtack, coffee, a new canteen, and refused to let Elena protest. You're going to need your money for when we reach a city, he said firmly. I've been saving wages for months. Let me help. Elena was not used to accepting help, but she was learning that pride was a luxury she could not afford. I'll pay you back someday, she promised. If you want, but there's no debt here, James said. Friends help each other. That's just how it works. Friends. The word settled into Elena's chest like a warm stone. She had not had a friend in 3 years, had almost forgotten what it felt like to be wanted around rather than avoided. She found herself smiling more as they worked together, found herself telling James stories about her childhood before the drought, before the tragedy, when her mother sang in the kitchen and her father laughed at dinner. James shared his own stories about Pennsylvania, about his father's quiet strength, about learning to ride horses in Texas after a childhood in coal country. "Do you miss it?" Elena asked on the second evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sun set in streaks of orange and purple. "Pennsylvania? I miss what it was before the explosion tours," James said. "After that, it wasn't home anymore. It was just the place where people looked at us like we'd murdered their relatives." He glanced at her. "I imagine you know that feeling." "Yes," Elena said softly. "Redemption used to feel like home. Now it's just the place where everyone hates me." "Then we'll find you a new home," James said with such confidence that Elena almost believed him. "Somewhere the rain still falls and people don't need scapegoats. That's the thing about the West. It's big enough for fresh starts." The night before they planned to leave, Elena was packing her last few belongings when she heard horses again. Her blood went cold, but when she looked out the window, she saw it was only James, arriving earlier than usual. She went out to meet him and saw immediately that something was wrong. His face was tight, and he dismounted quickly. "We need to leave tonight," he said without preamble. "I heard Garrett and some of the other ranchers talking. They're planning to come here tomorrow morning, and it's not just to make sure you're packed. They're talking about burning the house, making sure you have nothing to come back to, maybe worse." Elena felt ice in her veins despite the warm evening. "But the mayor said a week. The mayor's not leading this. Garrett is, and he's got a mean streak and a need to hurt something because his cattle are dying. He's convinced a few others that running you off isn't enough, that you need to be punished." James's gray eyes were fierce. "I'm not letting that happen. Can you be ready to ride in an hour?" Elena looked at her little house, at the garden where her mother used to grow tomatoes, at the porch where her father had taught her to whittle, everything she had left of the life before. "Yes," she said, "I can be ready." They worked in controlled urgency, loading Elena's trunk onto a travois James had hastily constructed, saddling the horses, securing supplies. Elena took one last walk through the house, touching the table her father had built, the shelf where her mother's few books still sat. She took the books and her mother's wedding shawl, the things she could not bear to leave. Everything else would stay for the fire that might come tomorrow or might not, but she could not take the risk. As they prepared to mount up, Elena turned back to look at the house one final time. "I should feel sadder," she said, "but all I feel is relieved." "That's because home isn't a building," James said gently. "It's the people who love you and the places you feel safe. Maybe you'll find a better one down the road." They rode out of Redemption under the cover of darkness, heading west toward San Antonio. The night was cool, blessedly cooler than the days had been, and the stars were brilliant overhead. Elena sat straight in her saddle, refusing to look back again. Whatever lay behind her was finished. Whatever lay ahead could not be worse than what she was leaving. They rode through the night, wanting to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Redemption before stopping to rest. James set a steady pace that ate up the miles without exhausting the horses, and Elena was grateful for his experience. She was a competent rider but not a seasoned traveler, and she would have made mistakes that cost them time and energy. As dawn broke over the scrubland, painting everything in shades of gold and rose, James led them off the main trail to a cluster of rocks that offered shade and concealment. "We'll rest here during the heat of the day and ride again this evening," he said. "Harder on us, easier on the horses, and less chance of running into anyone from Redemption." They unsaddled the horses and set up a simple camp. James started a small fire for coffee, while Elena unpacked some of the food. Her hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion and delayed fear, but she forced them steady. She was free. She had escaped, and she had not done it alone. "Thank you," she said as James handed her a tin cup of coffee. "You didn't have to do any of this. You could have just kept your job and let me figure things out on my own." James settled on the ground across from her, his own coffee steaming in the cool morning air. "I could have, But then I'd have been just like all those other people standing by while someone got hurt because it was easier than standing up. He met her eyes. My father taught me better than that. He said the measure of a man isn't what he does when people are watching. It's what he does when no one would blame him for looking away. Your father sounds like a good man. He was. He died 2 years ago. His lungs never recovered from the smoke when they burned our house. James's voice was even, but Elena heard the grief underneath. I think he'd be glad I helped you. It's what he would have done. They sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and listening to the morning birds. Elena felt exhaustion pulling at her, but also something else, something that felt almost like peace. She was away from the hateful stares, the whispered accusations, the constant weight of being blamed for things beyond her control. Out here in the open country, under the endless sky, she was just Elena, and the man across from her was just James, and the drought was just weather that had nothing to do with either of them. What will you do when we reach San Antonio? James asked. Find work, I suppose. I can sew and cook. Maybe a restaurant or a boarding house would hire me. Elena hesitated. What about you? Are you really heading to California? That was the plan, James said, but plans change. I thought I might see how San Antonio suits me first. If you don't mind the company a while longer. Elena's heart lifted. I don't mind at all. They took turns sleeping through the hottest part of the day, one keeping watch while the other rested. When Elena woke in the late afternoon, she found James had caught and roasted 2 rabbits, and the smell made her stomach clench with hunger. They ate as the sun began its descent, and then they packed up and rode on. The second night of riding was harder than the first. Elena's body ached from the unaccustomed hours in the saddle, and tiredness made her sway with the horse's movement. James noticed and suggested they stop more frequently to rest, but Elena shook her head stubbornly. The more distance we put between us and redemption, the safer we'll be, she said. You won't be safe if you fall off your horse from exhaustion, James pointed out, but his tone was gentle. There's a creek about an hour ahead. We'll stop there for a proper rest. The creek was barely more than a trickle, another victim of the drought, but the water was clean and cold. They refilled their canteens and let the horses drink their fill. Elena splashed water on her face, washing away the dust of the trail, and felt slightly more human. When she turned, she found James watching her with an expression she could not quite read. What? She asked, suddenly self-conscious. Nothing. Just thinking that you're handling this remarkably well, James said. Most people would be in pieces after what you've been through. Maybe I'll fall apart later when it's safe to, Elena said. Right now, I'm too busy surviving to have time for breaking down. That's as fair a strategy as any, James said with a slight smile. But when you do have time, and if you need someone to listen, I'm a decent audience. Something warm unfurled in Elena's chest. I'll remember that. They reached the outskirts of San Antonio on the 4th day of travel, dusty and exhausted but intact. The city sprawled before them, vastly larger than Redemption, with adobe and wooden buildings crowded together and the sound of voices in both English and Spanish filling the air. Elena stared at it all with wide eyes, feeling both intimidated and exhilarated. This was big enough to get lost in, big enough that no one would care about a cursed girl from a dying ranch town. Where to first, boy? James asked. I need to find a place to stay, Elena said. Somewhere cheap, at least, until I find work. They asked around and were directed to a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen, who had married a Chinese railroad worker and been left to fend for herself when he died in an accident. She looked at Elena's road-worn clothes and dusty face and quoted a price that was almost reasonable. I can pay a week in advance, Elena said, reaching for her small bag of coins. And what about your husband? Mrs. Chen asked, glancing at James. Same price for both of you together? Elena felt her face heat. Oh, we're not married. He's just my friend, James finished smoothly, though Elena thought she saw color in his face too. I'll be looking for a place of my own. Can you recommend somewhere nearby? Mrs. Chen gave them both a knowing look that made Elena want to sink through the floorboards, but she directed James to a men's boarding house 3 streets over. They arranged for Elena to move in immediately, and James helped carry her trunk up to the small, clean room that would be hers. It had a narrow bed, a washstand, a single chair, and a window that looked out on the street. After 3 years in her family's house and 4 nights sleeping on the ground, it looked like a palace. "Thank you," Elena said again, feeling like she had said those words 100 times, and still they were not enough. "For everything, James. I wouldn't have made it here without you." "You're stronger than you think," James said, "but I'm glad I could help." He hesitated in the doorway, hat in his hands. "May I call on you tomorrow? Make sure you're settling in all right?" "I'd like that," Elena said, and meant it more than she could express. After James left, Elena sat on the bed and let herself shake. The enormity of what had happened, what she had escaped, what she had risked, all came crashing down at once. She had left the only home she had ever known, had fled in the night with a man she barely knew, had ridden for days across dangerous country, and now she was in a strange city with almost no money and no prospects. It should have been terrifying. Instead, Elena felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. She was away from the accusations and the hatred. She had a friend who believed in her. She had a chance to start over. That was more than she'd had a week ago. The next day, Elena set about finding work. She visited restaurants and boarding houses, offering her services as a cook or a cleaner. Most places already had staff, but on the 3rd try, a cantina owner named Senora Reyes hired her to help in the kitchen during the dinner rush. The pay was modest, but it would be enough for her room and food with a little left to save. "You can cook?" Senora Reyes asked, eyeing Elena skeptically. "My mother taught me," Elena said. "I can make tortillas, tamales, pozole, enchiladas, anything you need." Senora Reyes had her make tortillas on the spot as a test. Elena's hands remembered the movements her mother had taught her, and the tortillas came out thin and perfect. Senora Reyes nodded, satisfied. "You start tomorrow evening. Don't be late." Elena practically floated back to the boarding house. She had work, she had a room, she had a chance. When James came by that evening as promised, she told him the good news, and his face lit up with genuine pleasure. "That's wonderful, Elena. I knew you'd land on your feet." "What about you?" she asked. "Have you found work?" "Starting at a stable tomorrow. The pay's decent and the owner seems honest. He's looking for someone who knows horses, and I convinced him I'm that someone." James grinned. "We're both going to be fine." They walked through San Antonio together as the evening cooled, James pointing out landmarks and Elena marveling at the size and bustle of the city. They found a small plaza with a fountain, and Elena stopped to stare at the water splashing freely. Such a contrast to the dying creek in Redemption. "It's strange to see water used like this," she murmured. "Just for beauty, not survival." "The drought's not as bad here," James said. "Or maybe the city's just better supplied. Either way, you don't have to ration every drop anymore." They sat on the edge of the fountain as the sky turned purple with dusk. People walked past, couples and families and groups of friends, and no one paid Elena and James any particular attention. It was glorious to be anonymous, to be unremarkable. "Do you miss it at all, Cheese?" James asked. "Redemption, I mean." Elena considered the question honestly. "I miss what it was before. I miss my mother and my father before he left, and the feeling of being part of a community. But what it became in the last 3 years? No, I don't miss that at all." "Do you think you'll ever go back?" "Not unless the rain returns and people forget they blamed me for it leaving," Elena said, which was to say probably never. "What about you? Will you go back to Pennsylvania?" "No," James said firmly. "That part of my life is over. I'm a Westerner now, for better or worse." "Better, I think," Elena said softly, "at least for me. If you hadn't come west, you wouldn't have been in Redemption to help me." James turned to look at her, and in the fading light, his eyes were very gray and very steady. I'm starting to think ending up in redemption was the luckiest thing that ever happened to me, even if the town itself was a nightmare. Because I met you. Elena's breath caught. James, I know it's fast, he said quickly. I know we've barely known each other a week, but Elena, I think you're the bravest, strongest person I've ever met. You stayed kind when people were cruel to you. You helped fight a fire for people who wanted you gone. You're rebuilding your life from nothing, and you're not complaining or giving up. I admire the hell out of you. He paused. And I'm falling in love with you. I wanted you to know. Elena's heart was hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. No one had ever said such things to her. No one had ever looked at her the way James was looking at her now, like she was something precious and remarkable. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything, James assured her. I'm not asking for promises. I just wanted to be honest. You deserve honesty after all the lies that town told about you. Elena reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. I'm falling in love with you too, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I think I started the night you first came to my house and told me what they were doing was wrong. No one had stood up for me in so long, and then you did. And you kept doing it. You believed in me when no one else would. How could I not fall in love with you? James's smile was like sunrise. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, carefully, like she was something that might break. You're not a curse, Elena Márquez. You're a blessing. My blessing, even if you weren't theirs. Elena felt tears slide down her face, but they were good tears, the kind that came from feeling too much happiness to contain. Say that again, she whispered. You're my blessing, James repeated, cupping her face with his free hand, his thumb brushing away her tears. Not a curse, not bad luck. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years, and I thank God or fate or whatever brought me to redemption just in time to find you. Elena leaned forward and kissed him, her first kiss, clumsy and perfect, and tasting of salt from her tears. James kissed her back with gentle certainty, his arms coming around her to hold her close, and Elena thought that this moment in a plaza in San Antonio with water splashing behind them and the stars emerging overhead, this was what home felt like. Not a building or a town, but a person who saw her truly and loved what he saw. They courted properly over the following months, though calling it courting seemed almost absurd given that they had crossed the desert together and declared their love within a week of meeting. But Elena appreciated the steadiness of it. The way James came by the boarding house after work to walk her to the cantina. The way he waited to walk her home again after her shift ended. They had dinner together on Sundays, their one mutual day off, and explored San Antonio hand in hand. James bought her a new shawl when her mother's got torn, and Elena mended his shirts when they wore thin. They talked about everything, their pasts, their dreams, their fears, their hopes for the future. I want land someday, James admitted one Sunday as they ate tamales from a street vendor. Not a huge ranch, just enough for some horses and maybe cattle, a place that's truly mine. That sounds perfect, Elena said. I want a garden, a real one that actually grows things. And maybe chickens again. We could have both, James said. Someday when we've saved enough. A small ranch with a garden and chickens, maybe near Fredericksburg or up in the hill country where the drought's not so bad. Elena caught the we in his statement and felt warmth spread through her chest. That sounds like a dream. Dreams come true sometimes, James said, taking her hand. Look at us. We made it out of redemption alive and built new lives here. That was a dream a few months ago. He was right. Elena had work she was good at. Senora Reyes had already increased her hours and her pay after customers started complimenting the food. She had a safe place to live and enough money to eat. She had friends among the other kitchen workers and the boarders at Mrs. Chen's house. She had James, who loved her and treated her with respect and made her laugh. It was more than she had ever hoped for during those dark years when everyone called her cursed. In October, 6 months after leaving Redemption, James asked Elena to marry him. They were at the fountain where they had first confessed their love, and he went down on one knee right there in the plaza despite the people watching. "I don't have much to offer you yet," he said, holding up a simple silver band, "but I have a steady job and savings growing and a whole lot of love for you. Will you marry me, Elena? Will you build that dream ranch with me?" "Yes," Elena said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, absolutely, yes." They married in November in a small ceremony at the Catholic Church, with Senora Reyes and the stable owner standing as witnesses. Elena wore a new dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar, and James wore his best shirt and a new vest. They could not afford a photographer, but Elena did not care. The important thing was the vows they spoke, promising to love and honor each other, to build a life together, to be each other's home. The priest smiled at them as he pronounced them husband and wife. "May God bless your union with rain in due season and prosperity all your days," he said, the standard blessing. But Elena saw James squeeze her hand at the mention of rain, both of them remembering redemption and the drought that had driven them together. They moved into a tiny house on the edge of San Antonio, just 2 rooms but theirs, the first place Elena had owned since leaving her childhood home. James carried her over the threshold, and Elena laughed at the tradition even as her heart swelled with joy. They furnished it slowly, buying a bed frame 1 month, a proper table the next, curtains and dishes, and all the small things that made a house a home. Elena continued working at the cantina, and James at the stable. They saved every spare cent, keeping their goal in mind. At night, they lay in their small bed and talked about the ranch they would have someday, planning it down to the smallest detail. James wanted a barn with space for at least 8 horses. Elena wanted fruit trees and a vegetable garden twice the size of the one her mother had kept. They both wanted a front porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sunset. In the spring of 1881, Elena realized she was pregnant. She told James one evening after work, nervous despite knowing he would be happy. They had talked about children in the abstract someday, but suddenly someday was very soon. James's reaction was everything she had hoped. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing, then set her down carefully as if she might break. "We're having a baby," he said wonderingly. "Elena, we're going to be parents. Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear it. "I'm ecstatic," James said, kissing her soundly. "Scared to death, but ecstatic. We're going to have a family." Their son was born in December of 1881, a cold month by San Antonio standards, but nothing like winter further north. Elena labored for 14 hours with Mrs. Chen and a midwife attending her, and when the baby finally came, crying lustily, Elena wept with relief and joy. James, who had been pacing outside, was allowed in to meet his son, and the look on his face when he held the tiny bundle made Elena fall in love with him all over again. "He's perfect," James whispered, staring down at the baby with wonder. "Elena, he's absolutely perfect." "What should we name him?" Elena asked, exhausted but happy. They had discussed names but never decided. Now James looked at his son's face, at Elena's tired smile, and said, "Samuel, after my father. He would have loved to meet him." "Samuel Colton," Elena said, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Samuel." The baby yawned, unimpressed with his new name, and both parents laughed softly. Parenthood, Elena discovered, was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Samuel was a good baby, healthy and strong, but he woke every few hours to nurse and required constant attention. Elena had to stop working at the cantina, at least for now, and money got tighter. But watching James with their son, seeing the gentleness and patience he showed, made every sleepless night worthwhile. By Samuel's first birthday, they had saved enough to start seriously looking for land. James heard about a parcel for sale near Bourne, in the hill country northwest of San Antonio. It was small, only 40 acres, but the price was manageable, and the land had a creek that ran year-round and grass that stayed greener than the drought-stricken areas to the south. They rode out to see it on a borrowed wagon, Samuel bundled between them, and Elena knew the moment she saw it that this was meant to be theirs. The property had a small house that needed work and a barn that needed more, but the bones were good. Oak trees provided shade, and the creek James had mentioned bubbled cheerfully over smooth stones. Elena could already envision her garden here, and James was eyeing the barn with plans clearly forming in his head. "What do you think?" he asked her. "I think it's perfect," Elena said. "I think we should buy it." They made an offer that afternoon and spent the next weeks in nervous anticipation waiting for the sale to finalize. When the deed was finally theirs, signed and official, Elena cried. She owned land. She and James had a ranch. The dream they had talked about in the plaza fountain was real. They moved to the property in the spring of 1883 when Samuel was 16 months old and starting to walk. The first months were hard work from dawn to dusk, repairing the house and barn, clearing land for the garden, building fences and corrals. James bought their first 2 horses with careful consideration, good breeding stock that could be the foundation of a larger herd. Elena planted her garden with seeds she had been saving for 2 years, and miracle of miracles, everything grew. The hill country had suffered in the drought too, but less severely than areas further south. Rain came irregularly, but it came, and the creek never stopped flowing. Elena would stand in her growing garden, feeling the mist from a passing shower, and think about redemption, where the townspeople had blamed her for the dry sky. She hoped they had gotten rain eventually. She hoped they had found some other explanation for their troubles. Mostly, she tried not to think about them at all. Life on the ranch was everything they had hoped. Hard work, yes, long days and constant maintenance, but it was work for themselves, building something that belonged to them and would pass to Samuel and any other children they might have. James proved to have a gift for training horses, and word spread. People started bringing him young horses to break and older ones to retrain, paying good money for his patience and skill. Elena's garden produced more than they could eat, and she started selling vegetables in Bourne, making connections with restaurants and families who wanted fresh produce. In the fall of 1883, Elena discovered she was pregnant again. This time, the news was less of a surprise and no less joyful. Samuel would have a sibling, and their family would grow. Their daughter, Catherine, was born in the spring of 1884, an easy birth compared to Samuel's, as if she knew her mother had done this before and did not need to make it difficult. She had James's gray eyes and Elena's dark hair, and a surprisingly loud cry for such a tiny thing. "We're outnumbered now," James said, holding Catherine while Samuel peeked curiously at his new sister. "2 children to 2 parents. We'll have to strategize." "We'll manage," Elena said, laughing. "We've managed everything else." And they did manage, through teething and childhood illnesses and the inevitable chaos of raising 2 young children while running a ranch. Samuel grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved the horses as much as his father did. Catherine was more adventurous, always trying to climb things she should not or explore places she had been told were off limits. Elena and James took turns being the strict parent and the indulgent one, finding a balance that worked for their family. The ranch prospered slowly but steadily. By 1886, they had 8 horses, including the 2 original breeding mares and their offspring. James's reputation as a trainer had spread through the hill country, and he always had work. Elena's garden had expanded to include fruit trees that were finally old enough to bear, and she had started keeping chickens again, better layers than the ones she'd had in Redemption. They hired a young man named Thomas to help with the heavy work, and he built himself a small cabin near the barn. One afternoon in the summer of 1886, Elena was picking tomatoes while Catherine helped by eating more than she put in the basket when a rider approached the house. Elena tensed instinctively. She still did not fully trust unexpected visitors, but relaxed when she saw it was just a man on a tired-looking horse, probably looking for directions or water. James came out of the barn to greet him, and Elena saw them talk for a few minutes. Then James looked toward her and beckoned. Elena handed the tomato basket to 6-year-old Samuel, told him to watch his sister, and walked over. "Elena, this is Daniel Perkins," James said. "He says he's from Redemption." Elena's blood went cold. Redemption? Daniel Perkins was perhaps 40, weathered and dusty from travel. He held his hat in his hands and looked uncomfortable. Yes, ma'am. I was passing through Bourne and heard about a horse trainer named Colton, and then I heard his wife's name was Elena, and I thought it might be you. Elena Márquez, I mean. It's Elena Colton now, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. What do you want? Nothing bad, ma'am, I promise. I just thought you'd want to know. The drought broke. 2 years ago, in the spring of 1884, the rains came back, and everything started growing again. The town's recovering, cattle herds are rebuilding, crops are coming in. He paused. And people feel real bad about how they treated you. Once the rain came back, and they had time to think clearly, a lot of folks realized they'd been wrong. They'd let fear make them cruel. Elena did not know what to say. Part of her wanted to feel vindicated. Part of her wanted to rage at how long she had suffered before they came to their senses. Mostly, she just felt tired. I'm glad the drought ended, she said finally. I never wished ill on redemption, even after everything. I know, ma'am, everyone knows that now. You tried to help fight the fire and everything. Daniel Perkins shifted his weight. Mayor Hutchins asked me to tell you that you're welcome back anytime. He said to tell you the town was wrong, and if you ever wanted to return, there'd be no more trouble. Thank you for the message, Elena said, but I won't be returning. My life is here now. Daniel nodded as if he had expected that answer. I understand. I just wanted to deliver the message and let you know the town's sorry, for whatever that's worth after all this time. It's worth something, James said, speaking for the first time since the introductions. His hand found Elena's, squeezing gently. It takes courage to admit you were wrong. Tell the mayor and the others that we appreciate the apology. But my wife is right. Our life is here. This is our home. After Daniel Perkins rode away, Elena stood looking at the hills in the distance, processing what she had learned. The drought had ended. Redemption had recovered. They were sorry. It should have felt like closure, but instead it felt like information about a place that no longer had anything to do with her. Are you all right? James asked. Yes, Elena said, and realized she meant it. I'm glad they're not suffering anymore. I'm glad the rain came back, but it doesn't change anything for me. They showed me who they were when things got hard, and I learned. I don't need their apology or their welcome. I have everything I need right here. She gestured to the ranch spread out before them, the house they had repaired with their own hands, the garden blooming with life, the barn where horses whinnied, the children playing under the oak tree. This was what mattered. This was home. James pulled her into his arms, and Elena leaned against him, feeling his strength and warmth. You're my blessing, he murmured into her hair, echoing the words he had said years ago by the fountain in San Antonio. You always were. From the first moment I saw you standing alone against that whole town, I knew you were special. I'm so glad I found you. I'm glad you found me too, Elena said. I'm glad you saw me when no one else would. I'm glad you believed in me. Everything good in my life now comes from that moment when you rode to my house and told me I wasn't alone. They stood together in the sunlight, holding each other while their children played and the ranch hummed with life around them. The drought that had driven them together was long over in Redemption and everywhere else, but the love it had sparked still burned bright, and the life they had built from ashes and faith and hard work was more solid than any rainfall. Years passed in the rhythm of ranch life, Samuel grew tall and serious, learning to train horses from his father and developing the same patient touch with animals. Catherine grew into a spirited girl who could ride before she could read properly and who had no fear of anything. In 1888, Elena gave birth to their third child, another son they named Michael. In 1891, their fourth and final child arrived, a daughter they called Rosa after Elena's mother. The ranch expanded gradually. They bought adjacent land when it became available, growing to 80 acres, then 100. The horse training business thrived to the point that James had to hire 2 more hands to help. Elena's produce was sold in stores throughout Bourne and neighboring towns. They built a larger house, a proper ranch house with 4 bedrooms, and a wide front porch where they sat in the evenings exactly as they had dreamed years ago. Samuel, at 18, started courting a girl from Bourne, and James teased Elena about becoming a mother-in-law someday soon. Catherine, at 16, was more interested in horses than boys, to her parents' relief and amusement. Michael and Rosa, still young, kept the household lively with their energy and constant questions. On their 15th wedding anniversary in November of 1896, James took Elena back to San Antonio. They left the children with Thomas and his wife, who had taken over much of the daily ranch operations, and spent 3 days in the city where their life together had truly begun. They visited the cantina where Elena had worked, and Senora Reyes, now elderly but still sharp, embraced her former employee with delight. They visited Mrs. Chen's boarding house, though Mrs. Chen herself had passed away 2 years prior. And they visited the plaza with the fountain, where they had confessed their love and where James had proposed. "Do you remember what I said here?" James asked as they sat on the edge of the fountain just as they had 15 years earlier. "You said I was your blessing, not theirs," Elena said softly. "You said you were falling in love with me." "And I meant every word. I still mean every word." James took both her hands in his. "You're still my blessing, Elena, every single day. You gave me a home and a family and a life I never dreamed I could have. You made me better than I was." "You saved me," Elena said, her eyes bright with tears. "You stood up for me when no one else would. You saw me as a person, not a curse. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You gave me everything: safety, love, children, a home that's truly mine. How could I not adore you?" They kissed there by the fountain, two people in their middle years who had built something remarkable from nothing, who had turned pain into purpose and fear into love. Around them the city bustled with life, but in that moment they were alone in the way that mattered, wrapped up in each other and the history they shared. The drought that had driven them together was 15 years gone, but the lesson remained. Hard times revealed character. Fear made people cruel or kind, depending on their nature. And sometimes the worst moments of life led directly to the best ones if you had the courage to keep moving forward and the grace to accept help when it was offered. Elena Márquez Colton had been called a curse, blamed for disaster, driven from her home by ignorance and fear. But she had survived, and she had thrived, and she had built a life so full of love and purpose that the years of suffering seemed like another person's story. The cowboy who had seen her worth when no one else did had become her husband, her partner, the father of her children, the love of her life. Together they had created something the townspeople of Redemption could never take away: a family, a home, a legacy of kindness in the face of cruelty. "You're my blessing, not theirs," James had said all those years ago, and he had spent every day since proving it true. Elena had bloomed under that love like her garden bloomed under rain, becoming more herself than she had ever been when people tried to make her small. She was a mother, a wife, a rancher, a woman who had survived the worst and created the best. She was blessed, and she was a blessing, and the drought that had once defined her was nothing more than a distant memory of rain that stopped and then started again, as rain always does. Their children grew and married and had children of their own. The ranch passed through generations, each adding their own touches but keeping the core that James and Elena had built. The story of how they met, how a cowboy had defended a woman the whole town had blamed for the drought, became family legend, told and retold until the details took on the polish of myth. But the truth at the heart of it remained unchanged. Love had triumphed over fear, faith over cruelty, and two people had found each other in the darkest time and made a light that lasted generations. Elena lived to be 73, dying peacefully in her sleep in the house she and James had built, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never known a day when she was called anything but beloved. James followed her 2 years later, and they were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, under oak trees that had been saplings when they first arrived. Their graves were marked with simple stones that read Elena Colton, beloved wife and mother, and James Colton, beloved husband and father. But the real monuments were the lives they had touched, and the family they had created, and the ranch that still thrived under their descendants' care. The drought that had once threatened to define Elena's entire existence was remembered only as the storm that blew two souls together, the hardship that revealed James's character and Elena's strength, the darkness before the dawn of everything beautiful that followed. They had been tested by fear and scapegoating and the cruelty of desperate people, and they had emerged with their humanity intact and their love unshakable. That was the story their grandchildren told and their great-grandchildren remembered, not the curse, but the blessing, not the blame, but the love that transcended it, not the drought, but the rain that eventually came, both from the sky and from the tears of joy shed by two people who found each other when they needed it most and built a forever from the wreckage of their separate pasts.